Hey everyone, Scott here. A brief heads up before we start this episode. This is the first in a series called Hollywood Hates History that I'm doing with fellow history podcaster Stephen Guerra, where we look at some of the most historically inaccurate movies that have been produced, which really says something because almost any movie is going to take liberties with the past, and I get it, we're not making a documentary for the Discovery Channel, but some are much worse than others. This episode is actually a rebroadcast of an episode I did with Steve last year. He has a great show called Beyond the Big Screen, and another one called A History of the Papacy. In this episode, we talked about the 2005 Ridley Scott movie, Kingdom of Heaven. Other episodes in this series will include the 2009 movie Agora, about the historical character Hypatia. We'll also talk about Dan Brown's Inferno, the movie The Conqueror about Genghis Khan, but starring John Wayne, so you can imagine how good that is. And then we're also going to look at a couple of movies that we thought did a good job with history, including the 2004 movie The Alamo with Billy Bob Thornton, and a movie that came out in 2014 called Dracula Untold. It's full of a lot of supernatural stuff about the vampire myth, but despite that, actually gets a lot of things right about 15th century Wallachia and the Ottoman Empire. Anyway, that's all for my preamble. I hope you enjoy the first episode in this mini-series, Hollywood Hates History.
This is Beyond the Big Screen podcast with your host, Steve Guerra.
Welcome back to Beyond the Big Screen. Today we are joined by Scott Rank of the History Unplugged podcast to discuss the 2005 movie Kingdom of Heaven, starring Orlando Bloom, Edward Norton, and many others. Kingdom of Heaven was directed by Ridley Scott, who brought us such great historically based movies like Gladiator. He also produced and/or directed Exodus, Gods and Kings, and Robin Hood, movies which we have discussed previously on Beyond the Big Screen. Today, we're not going to spend a lot of time picking through the accuracies and inaccuracies of this film, but instead look at some broad themes the movie brought up and look if these themes were applicable at the time. Scott, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Can you just tell us a little bit about yourself and your podcast?
Yeah, sure. My podcast is called History Unplugged, historyunpluggedpodcast.com. I try to aim for both breadth and depth in analyzing history. So once a week, I'll speak with a guest and have a long-form episode, talk to a book author, talk to historical consultant for movies, and then the other days of the week, I take questions from the audience and answer any question they have. The thing that I try to do is understand history as a foreign country, that you don't have to get too many decades into the past where humans are dealing with the same universal issues we all deal with: love, death, war, taxes. But the values can sometimes be startling. Now, the lazy way to look at that is to think, wow, people thought about things differently in the past. They were stupid. Why were they so stupid? But instead realize, okay, people responded differently. What were the historical conditions and social conditions present that made their reaction made sense? Because I think humans, for the most part, react in a sensible way to their circumstances, but people's circumstances can be so wildly different from us today that we have to dig in and make sense of that. And the Crusades is a wonderful example of, I think, how we misunderstand it. And, but yeah, that's a small slice of what I try to do.
And you are, or were, a professor who taught Middle Eastern studies?
Yeah, my focus is on the Ottoman Empire. My main area is in the 1800s and early 1900s, but I've taught a survey course on history of Christian-Muslim relations and one course in Istanbul to a mix of Christian and Muslim students, which made it very interesting. And then a religious studies course on Islam as well. So the Crusades comes up quite a bit. It's a big touchstone on Christian-Muslim relations.
Well, I think you're the perfect guest then to have on to discuss this movie.
I'll do my best. We'll see.
Now, let's just take the bird's eye view of the Crusades. This is what this movie is predominantly about, is about the Crusades. What were the Crusades?
Yeah, so the Crusades are interesting. I would say they're one of the most remarkable events in history. So first, I'll just give a little nugget of what they were and then some context of what caused them to happen, because I don't think they could have happened at much of any other time in history due to some unique developments. Okay, so what happens is all over Europe, over 100,000 people of multiple nationalities, and this is in a Europe that probably doesn't have more than about 30 million people or so, they spontaneously decide to leave their homes, they leave their families, they walk about 5,000 kilometers, or about 3,000 miles, they go through mountains, they go through deserts, they fight a war of which few of them return. This is the first crusade I'm talking about in 1099. So later crusades are organized by governments, they're organized by churches, and they're better planned, and they go by sea instead of walking. But what happens is that in 1099 or in 1095, there is a call to reclaim the Holy Land. The First Crusade is a battle to reclaim the city of Jerusalem from the current Muslim occupiers. It succeeds. For about a century, Jerusalem is held in European hands, and then there's other small Crusader kingdoms, Kingdom of Edessa, Kingdom of Tripoli, Kingdom of Antioch. They gradually fall. Jerusalem is then lost, and then there's tiny little principalities that are finally lost in 1291. So it's an attempt by Europeans to battle to reclaim the Holy Land, and then it's eventually lost. Okay, so that's the flyover view, and then I can drill more into what happened, or why did it happen? Why did a Crusader go on the crusade, and why did a Pope call for one, if you'd like?
Yeah, so we're still talking right now, the mindset of 1099. Why would somebody go to like you said, 3,000 miles away, 5,000 kilometers? So basically like going to the other side of the moon for them. Why would people do that, especially at this particular time in history? Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So, and we'll get in later about misconceptions of the Crusades, because perceptions of the Crusades are almost as important of a history as the Crusades themselves, because each generation reinterprets it, and I think they reinterpret it in their own image. But okay, so let's back up. The reason that Crusaders went on crusades, as much as it might not make sense to a modern person today, but a lot of scholars of the Crusades, like Jonathan Riley Smith of Cambridge, who's, I would say, the foremost historian of the Crusades, is for religious fervor. They went out of religious conviction the way that a Muslim would go to Mecca or Medina today. Here's some background of what's happening right up before the Crusades. In about 950, the Seljuk tribe of Turkish nomads cross from Central Asia, or they convert to Islam. They sweep across Iran, they head west, and in 1071, a leader named Alp Arslan defeats the Byzantines at the Battle of Manzikert, and it causes them to overrun most of Anatolia and almost threaten to conquer Constantinople itself. This is in the east. This is the Byzantine Empire. The Seljuk invasion triggers a period of instability and chaos in the Middle East. It's bad for the inhabitants, of course, but it's particularly negative on Christians who were making pilgrimages in large numbers to the Holy Land, to Palestine, to Jerusalem, to Bethlehem, to Nazareth. Now, here's what's interesting. Jerusalem was occupied by Muslims at this point for centuries. It was occupied in the 630s, very, very shortly after the death of the Prophet Muhammad. People who were companions of the Prophet conquered Jerusalem. Then it changed hands to different empires, the Umayyad Caliphate, the Abbasid Caliphate, and then the Seljuks eventually get control of it. But it's not so much about it being in Muslim hands that kicks off the Crusades, because that had been going on for centuries. No big surprise there. But previous Arab Muslims had no problems with Christian pilgrims coming into Jerusalem. In fact, they welcomed them because this was a huge source of revenue. If you had a wealthy knight or prince or king coming through, you would want these people to be fairly well protected. But the Turkish Seljuks, who now occupy the Holy Land, they had sort of the zeal or the fervor of recent converts to Islam, and they were much more intolerant. Pilgrims were harassed, pilgrims were persecuted, and we don't know how much of this news makes its way back to Europe, because news doesn't travel very easily at this time. But there is some sort of idea that Christians are being persecuted with attempted trips to the Holy Land. So that's one factor. The other factor is that in Constantinople, Byzantine Emperor Alexius I wasn't just a little bit threatened by people harassing his pilgrims, but the very existence of his empire is under threat. In March 1095, he sends sort of an urgent message to Pope Urban II in Rome asking for help. he probably expected that there'd be a few Italian or French mercenary warriors who would come and serve under the command of the Byzantine army to help fight. What he did not expect was about 100,000, well, I guess we could call them religious fanatics that show up at his door that really aren't under control of the Byzantine Empire to go and fight them. So the call for the Crusades really takes on a life of its own. Okay, so that's anyway, those are the conditions. Now, why did the Pope call for a crusade? What kicks off the crusade, what most historians tie it to, is a speech on November 27th, 1095, where Pope Urban II gives a speech at the Council of Clermont. We don't have a transcript of what he said. We have a few accounts that are written years or maybe even decades later. But the result is the 2 centuries of warfare that kicks off what we call the Crusades. So he mentions that the Saracens that the brothers in the East are under attack, and we need to go aid their cause, and we need to liberate the city of Jerusalem. He doesn't really talk a lot about Muslims themselves. The focus is on the city. Why would he call for this? At this point, there had been a schism between East and West in Christendom in 1054. And maybe the Pope thought that this could be a possibility to tie the East and the West closer together. Also, the office of the Pope is getting a lot more powerful at this time. 200, 300 years ago, there's no way the Pope would have been powerful enough to call for a crusade. During the rise of the Carolingian Empire with Charles the Great, basically the Pope was completely under the control of the Lombards and then the Frankish kingdom. So if he would have called for a crusade, no one would have cared because the Pope didn't have much power beyond his city walls. But the office of the papacy is growing in power. Perhaps the Pope sees this as an opportunity to project more power on the East, so he's willing to call for a crusade. But what shocks him is how many people rise up and answer the call. His predecessor in the 1060s actually called for a crusade against Spanish Muslims, and there were a few hundred knights that did answer the call, but there really wasn't that much effect at all militarily on Spain. So for people who say the Crusades were just about killing Muslims, well, why go to the Holy Land to kill Muslims when you can do it in Spain? But no one really cared about that because there wasn't an interest. Okay, so that's the kind of the motivation of the Pope. So what would be the motivation of an individual crusader to go on this crusade? At this time in history, there is an enormous growth in interest in pilgrimage. Think about the Canterbury Tales, where it's really a story of people going to the shrine of Thomas Becket. Pilgrimage is becoming very important to Christian identity. There's also millenarian ideas. That means kind of an apocalyptic view of the events of the end of the world coming about. And there's different spikes in history where people have this idea of the coming of Christ is imminent. In the 1400s and 1500s, this is big. In the 1800s, this is big. This causes a bunch of utopian movements in America. Some would argue today there's a lot of belief that some Christians, their views of the nation of Israel are affected by their belief that the return of Christ is imminent. So that is another thing that causes people to believe this. And there's kind of a really big belief in holy relics as well. So a lot of it comes down to simple religious conviction that would cause them to go on to the crusade. So about 100,000 people march out. By the time the main party reaches Jerusalem in June 1099, there's only about 13,000 people left, barely 10% of those that start out. Against all odds, they capture the city, then massacre many of the Muslim and Jewish inhabitants to what some would see punish them for their blasphemies against God. But then they also give many their freedom as well. So they're able to hold on to it. And then one last thing with a crusader is a crusade was regarded as an armed pilgrimage. So the word crusader wasn't what was used then. They would call themselves, I think, peregrinatii, which just means pilgrim. Crusaders took a vow similar to those taken by pilgrims. They were covered by the same laws and customs. You would receive the same spiritual benefit as a pilgrim. It's considered like an act of penance, and in return for which they received an indulgence, absolving them for the penalties of their sins. Now, that doesn't mean if you're going to hell, you got to get out of hell card or you get to spring someone from hell. That's not what that means. And Kingdom of Heaven depicts it as that, and that's not it. long story short, an indulgence properly understood, not everyone properly understood it, but it would shorten or eliminate your time in purgatory. So that's what, but it didn't get